Hello and welcome back to the ADP Nearshore PMP study group. This course is designed to complement your study efforts as you prepare to sit for PMI's Project Management Professional Certification exam. My name is Dennis DeCosta and I'll be facilitating today's web session on Project Scope Management. Okay, so let's talk about today's objectives. We are going to talk a little bit about Project Scope Management and look at the different process groups and touch a little bit on the processes. It's really important that you accompany this video with your reading and your PMBOK guide, as well as the Skillsoft courses to really build out and gain that knowledge that you're going to need to know for the exam when it comes to scope management. Let's move over to slide 3. So one thing that you're going to note about scope management is the processes only exist in 2 of the process groups. That would be the planning process group as well as the monitoring controlling process group. Looking at slide number 3, you see that there's plan scope management. Just like any of the different knowledge areas, you're going to plan how are you going to handle that particular management area. Also, you're going to create, that will be your subsidiary plan that rolls up into your ultimate project management plan, which you learned about in integration management. So scope management, when you plan your scope management plan, your output will be your project management plan for scope. That's going to be your subsidiary plan that ties nicely with the overall project management plan. Also in scope management, when it comes to planning, you're going to be doing things like collecting requirements. And based on those requirements, you're going to define your scope and then ultimately create your work breakdown structure. We'll talk about that in a second. Also in scope management, on the monitoring controlling side, you've got your validate scope and your control scope, 2 really key elements to making sure that your project is successful and you're giving your client or your customer exactly what they're looking for. Final tip. All right, starting on slide 4, let's talk about the scope management process and particularly look at the processing group of planning. So first off, you're going to develop your scope management plan. Like you're going to come to realize as you go through the other knowledge areas, as you develop your scope management plan, that whole process is really about identifying how are you going to manage that particular knowledge area. What are you going to do to make sure that you are only doing the work that is described in terms of creating that project, that product, service, or result. So it's really focused on your approach. How are you going to manage controlling your scope? How are you going to manage validating your scope? How are you going to collect requirements? What approaches are you going to take to collecting the requirements in terms of resources or requirements needed for that product, service, or result? Because that's twofold. Requirements for how the end result of the product would turn up, and the requirements or needs in terms of work effort for the project to create that product, service, or result. So really that's what developing the scope management plan is all about. The end result of the planning group for scope management is to create a scope statement and create a work breakdown structure and create a work breakdown structure dictionary. So your scope management plan is going to outline your approach, and it's going to turn up exactly what is needed to create what is called the scope baseline. So you'll notice on the slide, scope baseline is your scope statement, work breakdown structure, and work breakdown structure dictionary. Very important because those will be on your test. So next in the planning group is collecting requirements. You've already planned the approach on how you're going to collect requirements. Now this is the actual collecting of the requirements. So this is going to turn out some very important documents, your requirement document. It's going to outline exactly what's needed for not just the project to get the work done, but what is it that the client wants this product, service, or result to look like, to behave, to function. So it's really, that's a really important process here. Then there's a requirements traceability matrix. That's where you outline all the different requirements and you trace them back to the business need and the service or result. That's important because you want to be able to say, okay, in the project charter, the goal or the business need was this. That's why you're undertaking this project. And the metrics or the measurements, the SMART goals that are in place that will help determine the success of your project, or did you meet the requirement build? Is it did you meet those successes outlined? So that's what the requirement traceability matrix is about. It just takes those requirements that you've built out and it lines them up. It could be coded numerically or some other fashion. There's some great templates out there that you can look at for requirements traceability matrix. But it's important because that will help you ensure that you are meeting the goal and staying within scope and be able to measure that success as well. Then finally is your create work breakdown structure. This one is extremely important because this work breakdown structure is going to basically list out all the work effort in what's called work packages for the entire scope of the project. This will come into play in some of the other knowledge areas, and you will get to that when you get to cost estimating resources. You will trace that back to that particular work package. So I encourage you in the PMBOK guide, read the work breakdown structure section a couple of times because it's going to get a little confusing when they start saying code of accounts and control numbers and things like that. But really the PMBOK guide and your Skillsoft courses will tie that together nicely. All right, let's go over to slide number 5. Let's talk about the monitoring controlling process group and the two processes that exist there. So we have validate scope and control scope. So let's start with control scope. Pretty simple. You're going to monitor the project. You're going to monitor the work that's being done, the outputs from that, to make sure that only the work identified for the project in the work breakdown structure, only the functionality or characteristics of the product are being built out, and nothing else. You want to make sure there is no scope creep, that someone is putting something else into play because you didn't plan for that. So it's really important. That's what you're controlling. You're controlling your scope baseline. You're controlling to make sure that everything is following that scope statement. You're following to see that the work packages in your work breakdown structure is the work that's being worked on and nothing else. Remember, time is money, and you've allocated resources, time, people, or materials to a specific creation of a deliverable, and you don't want anything getting in the way of getting that accomplished and having additional things thrown in. I am going to tell you one term that you'll probably find in some of your practice quizzes. It's called gold plating. Gold plating is something similar to scope creep, but gold plating is really when the part of the development team says, you know what, I think the client will ultimately like this. It's a real easy update. Let me go ahead and put this in, and it costed no money, no additional resources or materials. Let's just go ahead and put that in. That is bad. because remember, when you control scope, you're controlling to make sure that only what is defined in your approved baseline, which is your scope statement, work breakdown structure, and work breakdown dictionary, is the only thing that gets into that project as your deliverable. So gold plating is bad, scope creep can be bad as well, and very costly. Okay, finally, validate scope. Here's where you're doing your extra effort to make sure the deliverables that your team is handing over to you, that you're verifying and you're making sure that the product scope and the project scope has been met for that deliverable. It is, it's your responsibility to make sure that this is, it's turning out exactly the way it was described, because you are the project manager. So validate scope and control scope, very, very important. You need to remember that those two need to be performed in order for you to ensure that the work that was allocated for the project is the only work being done and nothing else. And you need to make sure that those deliverables are meeting the expectations of the requirements in your requirements documentation and in your scope statement. When it comes to scope management, you really need to understand the difference between the product scope and the project scope. So when we talk about product scope, we're talking about those features, those characteristics that define and make up that product that you're delivering. And when we talk about project scope, we're talking about the scope of work involved in creating that product, or the scope of work to be done during your project. Those are two key terms you're going to see quite often, and because they look very similar, as you're reading lengthy questions, they may throw in something about product scope and then throw something in about the project scope, and then the question is actually asking you something about product scope. And then the answers, they're going to be a blend between an answer talking about project scope or product scope. So I know it just sounds really crazy, but you got to pay attention to how your questions are written. So the difference between product scope, it defines the characteristics, the functionality, how that item service or result is to perform, and project scope is outlining all the work, the scope of work that will be performed. All right, so that wraps up today's session on project scope management. Now I know you're thinking, well, what about the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs? So you'll notice in your virtual PMP folder for scope management, you will have this presentation. Attached to this presentation are all the slides for your inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. Please make sure you read your PMBOK guide, take your Skillsoft classes, answer your discussion board questions, and participate and engage with your fellow students. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us on the PMP network.